Hi, I'm Pranamya and you're watching Pages of the Globe. So if you're new to my channel, basically every day I read stories, I tell you a little bit about their author, and I give you an analysis about them. Before you scroll away thinking, oh my god, I do not want to hear a 10-year-old read a short story, I can promise you, A, I'm not 10 years old, and B, if you go ahead and look at the intro video pinned on my channel, you will learn that I actually can, read stories and give deep analysis about them. At least I like to think I can. But if you don't want to go ahead and watch that, it basically just tells you that, I have the credentials and I promise you I can do it. You just have to trust me. Without further ado, let's get on with the intro. So today, the story that I'm going to be telling you is Through the Tunnel by Doris Lessing. Now, Doris Lessing was born in 1919, and she died in 2013. She was a prolific British novelist, poet, and playwright, known for her powerful narratives and keen observations of society. Some very key facts about her, I'm just going to give you the rundown basically. She was born in Persia, which is now Iran. Her family moved to Zimbabwe when she was 6 years old. Now, some of her best-known work that you might have read or heard of is her novel, The Golden Notebook, published in 1962, which is considered a landmark of feminist literature. Other notable works include The Grass is Singing, published in 1950, The Children of Violence series, and The Good Terrorist, published in 1985. Now, the themes that you'll often see in her writing are colonialism, feminism, social justice, and the individual's relationship to society. She also frequently addresses issues related to race and gender. She has been awarded a Nobel Prize in Literature in 2007, and her influence and legacy is mainly just her work has influenced a generation of writers and thinkers. She is regarded as one of the most important British writers of the 20th century. Now, as for the story itself, Through the Tunnel, it's a short story first published in 1955. It centers on a young English boy named Jerry who was on vacation with his mother at a beach in a foreign country, who we're going to assume it's somewhere near Zimbabwe because that's where she actually grew up, like I said before. Now, through his journey, the story delves into the psychological and physical efforts that Jerry undergoes to achieve his goal, which you will learn more about later on. Without further ado, let's get on with the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like me to read next. Through the Tunnel by Doris Lessing. Going to the shore on the first morning of the vacation, the young English boy stopped at a turning of the path and looked down at a wild and rocky bay, and then over to the crowded beach he knew so well from other years. His mother walked on in front of him, carrying a bright striped bag in one hand. Her other arm, swinging loose, was very white in the sun. The boy watched that white naked arm and turned his eyes, which had a frown behind them, toward the bay, and then back again to his mother. When she felt he was not with her, she swung around. "Oh, there you are, Jerry," she said. She looked impatient, then smiled. "Why, darling, would you rather not come with me? Would you rather—" She frowned, conscientiously worrying over what amusements he might secretly be longing for, which he had been too busy or too careless to imagine. He was very familiar with that anxious, apologetic smile. Contrition sent him running after her, and yet, as he ran, he looked back over his shoulder at the wild bay. And all morning, as he played on the safe beach, he was thinking of it. Next morning, when it was time for the routine of swimming and sunbathing, his mother said, "Are you tired of the usual beach, Jerry? Would you like to go somewhere else?" "Oh, no," he said very quickly, smiling at her out of that unfailing impulse of contrition, a sort of chivalry. Yet walking down the path with her, he blurted out, "I'd like to go and have a look at those rocks down there." She gave the idea her attention. It was a wild-looking place, and there was no one there, but she said, "Of course, Jerry. When you've had enough, come to the big beach, or just go straight to the villa if you like." She walked away, that bare arm now slightly reddened from yesterday's sun, swinging, and he almost ran after her again, feeling it unbearable that she should go by herself, but he did not. She was thinking, of course, he's old enough to be safe without me. Have I been keeping him too close? He mustn't feel he ought to be with me. I must be careful. He was an only child, 11 years old. She was a widow. She was determined to be neither possessive nor lacking in devotion. She went worrying off to her beach. As for Jerry, once he saw that his mother had gained her beach, he began the steep descent to the bay. From where he was, high up among the red-brown rocks, it was a scoop of moving bluish-green fringed with white. As he went lower, he saw that it had spread among small promontories and inlets of rough, sharp rock, and the crisping, lapping surface showed stains of purple and darker blue. Finally, as he ran sliding and scraping down the last few yards, he saw an edge of white surf and the shallow, luminous movement of water over white sand, and beyond that, a solid, heavy blue. He ran straight into the water and began swimming. He was a good swimmer. He went out fast over the gleaming sand, over a middle region where rocks lay like discolored monsters under the surface, and then he was in the real sea, a warm sea where irregular cold currents from the deep water shocked his limbs. When he was so far out that he could look back, not only on the bay, but past the promontory that was between it and the big beach, he floated on the buoyant surface and looked for his mother. There she was, a speck of yellow under an umbrella that looked like a slice of orange peel. He swam back to the shore, revealed at being sure she was there, but all at once very lonely. On the edge of the small cape that marked the side of the bay away from the promontory was a loose scatter of rocks. Above them, some boys were stripping off their clothes. They came running, naked, down to the rocks. The English boy swam toward them, but kept his distance at a stone's throw. They were of the coast. All of them were burnt, smooth, dark brown, and speaking a language he did not understand. To be with them, all of them, was a craving that filled his whole body. He swam a little closer. They turned and watched him with narrowed, alert, dark eyes. Then one smiled and waved. It was enough. In a minute, he had swum in and was on the rocks beside them, smiling with a desperate, nervous supplication. They shouted cheerful greetings at him, and then, as he preserved his nervous, uncomprehending smile, they understood that he was a foreigner, strayed from his own beach, and they proceeded to forget about him. But he was happy. He was with them. They began diving again and again from a high point into the well of blue sea between rough pointed rocks. After they had dived and came up, they swam around, hauled themselves up, and waited their turn to dive again. They were big boys, men to Jerry. He dived, and they watched him, and when he swam around to take his place, they made way for him. He felt he was accepted, and he dived again, carefully, proud of himself. Soon, the biggest of the boys poised himself, shot down into the water, and did not come up. The others stood about, watching. Jerry, after waiting for the sleek brown head to appear, let out a yell of warning. They looked at him idly, and turned their eyes back to the water. After a long time, the boy came up on the other side of a big dark rock, letting the air out of his lungs in a spluttering gasp and a shout of triumph. Immediately the rest dived in. One moment, the morning seemed full of chattering boys. The next, the air and the surface of the water were empty, but through the heavy blue, dark shapes could be seen moving and groping. Jerry dived, shot past the school of underwater swimmers, saw a black wall of rock looming at him, touched it, and bobbed up at once to the surface, where the wall was a low barrier he could see across. There was no one visible. Under him in the water, the dim shapes of the swimmers had disappeared. Then one and then another of the boys came up on the far side of the barrier of rock, and he understood they had swum through some gap or hole in it. He plunged down again. He could see nothing through the stinging salt water but the blank rock. When he came up, the boys were all on the diving rod, preparing to attempt the feat again. And now, in a panic of failure, he yelled up in English, "Look at me! Look at me! Look!" And he began splashing and kicking in the water like a foolish dog. They looked down gravely, frowning. He knew the frown. At moments of failure, when he clowned to claim his mother's attention, it was with this grave, embarrassed inspection that she rewarded him. through his hot shame, feeling the pleading grin on his face like a scar he could never remove. He looked up at the group of the big brown boys on the rock and shouted, "Bonjour, merci, au revoir, monsieur, monsieur," while he hooked his fingers round his ears and waggled them. Water surged in his mouth. He choked, sank, came up. The rock, lately weighted with boys, seemed to rear up out of the water as their weight was removed. They were flying down past him into the water. The air was full of falling bodies. Then the rock was empty in the hot sunlight. He counted 1, 2, 3. At 50, he was terrified. They must all be drowning beneath him in the watery caves of the rock. At 100, he stared around him at the empty hillside, wondering if he should yell for help. He counted faster, faster to hurry them up, to bring them to the surface quickly, to drown them quickly. Anything rather than the terror of counting on and on into the blue emptiness of the morning. And then, at 160, the water beyond the rock was full of boys, blowing like brown whales. They swam back to the shore without a look at him. He climbed back to the diving rock and sat down, feeling the hot roughness of it underneath his thighs. The boys were gathering up their bits of clothing and running off along the shore to another promontory. They were leaving to get away from him. He cried openly, fists in his eyes. There was no one to see him, and he cried himself out. It seemed to him that a long time had passed, and he swam out to where he could see his mother. Yes, she was still there, a yellow spot under an orange umbrella. He swam back up to the big rock, climbed up, and dived into the blue pool among the fanged and angry boulders. Down he went until he touched the wall of rock again, but the salt was so painful in his eyes that he could not see. He came up to the surface, swam to shore, and went back to the villa to wait for his mother. Soon she walked slowly up the path, swinging her striped bag, the flushed, naked arm dangling beside her. "I want some swimming goggles," he painted, defiant and beseeching. She gave him a patient, inquisitive look as she said casually, "Well, of course, darling." But now, he must have them this minute and no other time. He nagged and pestered until she went with him to a shop, and as soon as she bought the goggles, he grabbed them from her hand as if she was going to claim them for herself, and was off, running down the steep path to the bay. Jerry swam out to the big barrier rock, adjusted the goggles, and dived. The impact of the water broke the rubber-enclosed vacuum, and the goggles came loose. He understood that he must swim down to the base of the rock from the surface of the water. He fixed the goggles tight and firm, filled his lungs, and floated face down on the water. Now he could see. It was as if he had the eyes of a different kind, fish eyes that showed everything clear and delicate, wavering in the bright water. Under him, 6 or 7 feet down, was a floor of perfectly clean, shining white sand, rippled, firm, and hard by the tides. 2 grayish shapes steered there like long, rounded pieces of wood or slate. They were fish. He saw them nose toward each other, poise motionless, and make a dart forward, swerve off, and then come round again. It was like a water dance. A few inches above them, the water sparkled as if sequins were dripping through it. Fish, again, myriads of minute fish, the length of his fingernail, were drifting through the water, and in a moment he could feel the innumerable tiny touches of them against his limbs. It felt like swimming in flaked silver. The gray rock the big boys had swum through rose sheer out of the white sand, black, tufted lightly with greenish weed. He could see no gap in it. He swam down to its base, and again he rose, took a big chestful of air, and went down. Again and again he groped over the surface of the rock, feeling it, almost hugging it, in the desperate need to find an entrance. And then, once he was clinging to the black wall, his knees came up, and he shot his feet forward, and they met no obstacle. He had found the hole. He gained the surface, clambered about the stones that littered the barrier rock until he found a big one, and with this in his arms, let himself down over the side of the rock. He dropped with weight straight to the sandy floor. Clinging tight to the anchor of the stone, he lay on his side and looked in under the dark shelf at the place where his feet had gone. He could see the hole. It was an irregular dark gap, but he could not see deep into it. He let go of his anchor, clung with his hands to the edges of the hole, and tried to push himself in. He got his head in, found his shoulders jammed, moved them in sidewise, and was inside as far as his wrist. He could see nothing ahead. Something soft and clammy touched his mouth. He saw a dark frond moving against the grayish rock, and panic filled him. He thought of octopuses, of clinging weed. He pushed himself backward and caught a glimpse, as he retreated, of a harmless tentacle of seaweed drifting in the mouth of the tunnel. But it was enough. He reached the sunlight, swam to shore, and lay on the diving rock. He looked down into the blue well of water. He knew he must find himself through that cave, or hole, or tunnel, and out the other side. First, he thought, he must learn to control his breathing. He let himself down into the water with another big stone in his arms, so that he could lie effortlessly on the bottom of the sea. He counted 1, 2, 3. He counted steadily. He could hear the movement of blood in his chest. 51, 52. His chest was hurting. He let go of the rock and went up in the air. He saw the sun was low. He rushed to the villa and found his mother at her supper. She said only, "Did you enjoy yourself?" And he said yes. All night the boy dreamed of the water-filled cave in the rock, and as soon as breakfast was over, he went to the bay. That night his nose bled badly. For hours he had been under the water, learning to hold his breath, and now he felt weak and dizzy. His mother said, "I shouldn't overdo things, darling, if I were you." That day and the next, Jerry exercised his lungs as if everything, the whole of his life, all that he would become, depended on it. Again, his nose bled at night, and his mother insisted on his coming with her the next day. It was a torment to him to waste a day of his careful self-training, but he stayed with her on that beach, which now seemed a place for small children, a place where his mother might lie safe in the sun. It was not his beach. He did not ask for permission on the following day to go to his beach. He went before his mother could consider the complicated rights and wrongs of the matter. A day's rest, he discovered, had improved his count by 10. The boys had made the passage while he counted 160. He had been counting fast in his fright. Probably now, if he tried, he could get through that long tunnel, but he was not going to try yet. A curious, most unchildlike persistence, a controlled impatience made him wait. In the meantime, he lay under water on that white sand, littered now by stones he had brought down from the upper air, and studied the entrance to the tunnel. He knew every jut, every corner of it as far as possible. It was as if he already felt its sharpness around his shoulders. He sat by the clock in the villa when his mother was not near and checked his time. He was incredulous, and then proud to find out he could hold his breath without strain for 2 minutes. The word 2 minutes authorized by the clock brought close the adventure that was necessary to him. In another 4 days, the mother said casually one morning they must go home. On the day before they left, he would do it. He would do it if it killed him, he said defiantly to himself. But 2 days before they were to leave, a day of triumph when he increased his count by 15, his nose bled so badly that he turned dizzy and had to lie limply over the big rock like a bit of seaweed, watching the thick red blood flow out onto the rock and trickle slowly down the sea. He was frightened. Supposing he's turned dizzy in the tunnel? Supposing he died there, trapped? Supposing his head went around in the hot sun and he almost gave up? He thought he would return to the house and lie down, and next summer, perhaps, when he had had another year's growth in him, that he would go through the hole. But even after he had made the decision, or thought he had, he found himself sitting up on that rock and looking down into the water, and he knew that at this moment, when his nose had only just stopped bleeding, and his head was still sore and throbbing, this was the moment he would try. If he did not do it now, he never would. He was trembling with fear that he would not go, and he was trembling with horror at the long, long tunnel under the rock, under the sea. Even in the open sunlight, the barrier rock seemed very wide and very heavy. Tons of rock pressed down on where he would go. If he died there, he would lie until one day, perhaps not before next year, those big boys would swim into it and find it blocked. He put on his goggles, fitted them right, tested the vacuum. His hands were shaking. Then he chose the biggest stone he could carry, slipped over the edge of the rock until half of him was in the cool enclosing water and half in the hot sun. He looked up once at the empty sky, filled his lungs once, twice, then sunk fast to the bottom with a stone. He let it go and began to count. He took the edges of the hole in his hands and threw himself into it, wriggling his shoulders in sidewise as he remembered he must, kicking himself along with his feet. Soon he was clear inside. He was in a small rock-bound hole filled with yellowish-gray water. The water was pushing him against the roof. The roof was sharp and pained his back. He pulled himself along with his hands fast and used his legs as levers. His head knocked against something sharp. A sharp pain dizzied him. 50, 51, 52. He was without light, and the water seemed to press upon him with the weight of the rock. 71, 72. There was no strain on his lungs. He felt like an inflated balloon. His lungs were still light and easy, but his head was pulsing. He was being continually pressed against the sharp roof, which felt slimy as well as sharp. Again he thought of octopuses and wondered if the tunnel might be filled with weed that could tangle him. He gave himself a panicky, convulsive kick forward, ducked his head, and swam. His feet and hands moved freely as in the open water. The hole must have widened out. He thought he must be swimming fast, and he was frightened of banging his head if the tunnel narrowed. 100, 101. The water paled. Victory filled him. His lungs were beginning to hurt. A few more strokes and he would be out. He was counting wildly. He said 115, and then a long time later 115 again. The water was a clear jewel green all around him, and then he saw above his head a crack running through the rock. Sunlight was falling through it, showing the clean, dark rock of the tunnel, a single mussel, 2 shells, and a darkness ahead. He was at the end of what he could do. He looked up at the crack as if it were filled with air and not water, as if he could put his mouth to it and draw in air. 115, he heard himself say in his head, but he had said that so long ago. He must go into the blackness ahead or he would drown. His head was swelling, his lungs cracking. 115 pounded through his head, and he feebly clutched at rocks in the dark, pulling himself forward, leaving the brief space of sunlit water behind him. He felt he was dying. He was no longer quite conscious. He struggled on in the darkness between lapses into unconsciousness. An immense swelling pain filled his head, and then the darkness cracked with an explosion of green light. His hands groping forward meant nothing, and his feet, kicking back, propelled him out into the open air. He drifted to the surface, his face turned up to the air. He was gasping like a fish. He felt he would sink now and drown. He could not swim the few feet back to the rock. Then he was clutching it, pulling himself onto it. He lay face down, gasping. He could see nothing but a red vein clotted dark. His eyes must have burst, he thought. They were full of blood. He tore off his goggles, and a gout of blood went into the sea. His nose was bleeding, and the blood had filled the goggles. He scooped up handfuls of water from the cool, salty sea to splash on his face, and did not know whether it was blood or salt water he had tasted. After a time, his heart quieted. His eyes cleared, and he sat up. He could see the local boys diving and playing half a mile away. He did not want them. He wanted nothing but to get back home and lie down. In a short while, Jerry swam to the shore and climbed slowly up the path to the villa. He flung himself on his bed and slept, waking at the sound of feet on the path outside. His mother was coming back. He rushed to the bathroom, thinking she must not see his face, with blood stains or tear stains on it. He came out of the bathroom and met her as she walked into the villa, smiling, her eyes lighting up. "Have a nice morning?" she asked, laying her head on his warm brown shoulder for a moment. "Oh, yes, thank you." "You look a bit pale," and then sharp and anxious. "How did you bang your head?" "Oh, just banged it," he told her. She looked at him closely. He was strained. His eyes were glazed-looking. She was worried. And then she said to herself, "Oh, don't fuss. Nothing can happen. He can swim like a fish." They sat down to lunch together. "Mummy," he said, "I can stay underwater for 2 minutes. 3 minutes at least." It came bursting out of him. "Can you, darling?" she said. "Well, I shouldn't overdo it. I don't think you ought to swim any more today." She was ready for a battle of wills, but he gave in at once. It was no longer of the least importance to go to the bay. The end. So that was Through the Tunnel by Doris Lessing. Now before I jump straight into the analysis, I'm going to tell you a little bit I'm just going to give a quick summary. So the story begins with Jerry and his mom who are on vacation to this coastal town that we don't know where. And it's clear that they visited this place many times because they have a set routine of they stay at a villa and then they go to this popular beach that kind of everyone goes to. But while they're walking there, Jerry notices this wild and rocky bay, and he asks his mom the next day if he can go there. And with some hesitancy, she's like, okay, fine. Now, Jerry is just he's swimming there, and he's just kind of chilling when he notices this group of older local boys who are diving and playing in the water. And he's so lonely. We learn that he's an only child, and so he really wants to just be accepted by them. So he swims over to them, and once they realize that he can't speak the same language, they kind of ignore him, but they're all just diving around, and he feels accepted at one point because he's like, okay, we're all diving, we're all having fun, and he's genuinely having a good time. Now at one point, this one boy dives into the water and doesn't come up. Jerry is like shocked, he's surprised, he's yelling at the other boys, and they don't really seem to care. And then he comes out on another side of this large rock, and the rest of them do the same routine. Jerry goes in after them, but he can only see the rock. He doesn't see how they're going through it. And then, when they suddenly reappear, they realize they must have passed through an underwater tunnel. And Jerry's desperate for their approval. He's trying to speak to them in broken French, but they're like very unimpressed. And one by one, the boys dive back into the water, and then they disappear, and they leave him at one point. Now at this point he starts to cry because he's like, oh, my friends just abandoned me. And he makes his mom go and buy him a pair of goggles so that he can figure out where the tunnel is. And then he starts training so hard just to pass this underwater tunnel. He holds his breath, he tries to control his breathing, and oftentimes his nose will bleed, his head gets dizzy, it's throbbing, he's getting headaches, but he's determined to swim through this tunnel. And then the day before they leave, he decides to do it. And it's such a scary moment, honestly. I felt like I was on the edge of my seat as I was recording. I was like, oh my god, he needs to survive, what's gonna happen? And it's so scary, but he finally gets through the tunnel. And when he comes back out, he's bleeding everywhere. His goggles were filled with blood. He's so tired. He's crying. It's awful. But at that point, he decides, okay, I'm done. I've done what I need to do, and no more do I need to continue this. And that's where the story ends. Now, at first, this seems like a almost children's short story because it just seems like a well-written story, sure, but you don't really understand what's going on. But from the opening sentence, you see these two initial thematic splits. One between Jerry and his mom, and then another between this overcrowded beach and the rocky bay. Because as they walk through the beach, Jerry sees this rocky bay. And that's like a fork in the path, because this beach is tame and familiar, while the rocky bay is more rugged and unknown. Now, with the local boys, we see that while Jerry is very excited to finally be able to explore on his own, he still feels the need to, first of all, make sure that his mother is doing okay without him, because he's always checking in on her. But with these local older boys, he also very badly wants to be part of their group. And because he can seemingly swim well as they can, he is sort of able to, but his inability to speak their language not only makes him inferior to them in age, but in stature, but also in ability. But even though they still have this attainable form of maturity for Jerry, even if they want nothing to do with him, he needs their approval. Now, as a last effort of earning these older boys' respect, Jerry frantically tries to get a laugh out of them, but he doesn't even know their native language, so he tries to speak very common phrases in French, oh, bonjour, merci, au revoir, and they're okay. And this is obviously, at this point, we're guessing that this coastal town is somewhere in France or a place where they speak French, because these local boys speak French. Now at this point, Jerry has definitively been rejected from their small community, and they have this sort of disdain for him as an outsider. Now, when he's trying to swim through this tunnel, first of all, we're noticing that his health is deteriorating, which is not, obviously, that's something, normally when one's nose starts to bleed, they're like, okay, I need to take a break, but he just continuously tries. And as he swims through this tunnel, which is obviously an incredibly scary experience, he still ultimately achieves his goal. However, he at this point has suffered so much physical distress, and the pain is perhaps like this ultimate mark of Jerry's new hard-won endurance and general sense of confidence, because at this point the only way he can truly earn maturity is through these physical setbacks. And the reason for that is that he's correlated this sense of maturity to these older boys. And because these older boys could swim through this tunnel, he needs to as well, or he's not ever going to feel accomplished. Now, what is the real meaning behind this? We really just see how Jerry is moving through this experience, swimming the secret tunnel, to emerge into adulthood and go on the other side. He has passed this maturity test that he himself set, and through physical endurance, not just physical endurance, but also mental endurance, he was able to pass it, and now he has achieved this level. And once he reached that level, he very quickly, as soon as he saw the older boys again, and he didn't feel anything for them, because at this point he realized, I am equal to them now, or at least in his mind he thinks he's equal to them now, and he has no need for validation from them. Now, I have to say, as I was reading the story, I honestly really just want to know where they went, because I was like, this seems like such a nice place. I do believe they went like somewhere. Doris Lessing often sets her stories in like her native Zimbabwe, so I'm assuming this is set in like coastal Africa. But just reading the story was so incredibly, like, the writing of it was so beautiful, and I do truly love Doris Lessing. I think she writes some amazing stories. If you guys ever want me to read another story of hers, I will readily do so. I have an entire book. I really do love her stories. I have found that oftentimes, at first glance, her stories feel just like a window into reality. Just like, this still felt like a very simple story. This is probably something that's happened before. It just felt very, very, I don't want to say 2D because the writing was so good, but it was a very simple story. However, she brought it to life, really, with this deeper connection, especially with the older boys. And the way she worded everything, I think, really had a powerful effect on how the reader viewed each character. Now, I don't want to make this video too long, so I am going to end it here. But remember to like, share, subscribe, and please comment down below which short story you would like me to read next. I promise I will read any short story you want me to. That is it for today. Bye!